All right, so it is my absolute pleasure to welcome you to this session, our second session on policy briefs. I'm Dr. Kyle Rich at Brock University, and it is my pleasure to introduce Ashley Whedon, who is a very, very soon to be finished PhD candidate, like within weeks. I'm so lucky that we were able to snag her for this session. We are going to be facilitating your session today. With that, I'm just going to turn it over to Ashley, and you can kick things off.
Wonderful. Well, thank you so much for having me. And yes, 2 weeks, November 23rd. So everybody cross fingers, toes, eyes, whatever is useful for getting us there. And then hopefully that will come as well. But today, Kyle's asked me to come talk to you about policy briefs. So a little bit about my background and why that is something I can speak to is I come from government. I'm a recovering public servant that for some reason or another went into academia after the first third of my career. And I spend a lot of my time working with decision makers and thinking about how we get good evidence into policy and practice. And so this has become strangely my bread and butter and something that I think a lot about and I'm weirdly excited about. I think it's a really important skill set that is underutilized by a lot of different disciplines and is a really effective tool for getting all of the wonderful stuff inside your brain from both your research and from your practice if you're a practitioner into the hands and minds of the people who will do something with it. So this is a skill set that can help clarify your own thoughts on your research, can help you think through what actually is the policy impact of your research, because we can't just kind of mumble and has implications for policy at the end of a paper and not actually get into the specifics of what that is, and gives you sort of the exercises in working through that. So we're going to spend a lot of today we're thinking about the process of doing these things, not necessarily the content. So I'll be asking you to step outside of your own research thing, but think about how you would apply this process to your own work, because it really is a skill and a muscle that we learn by doing, not something that sort of arrives fully formed. So today, I'm hoping that by the end of today's couple hours together, if you're not already familiar, you'll have a renewed understanding of what the different types of policy briefs are, because there are different ways of going about doing this. And we'll talk a little bit about some of the more innovative approaches that are coming up and proving to be really impactful, as well as the traditional kind of 3 to 5 page written report, as well as sort of a new or a renewed appreciation for knowledge mobilization's role in policy making and how you can use different tools to affect that change. Because what good is our research if we don't actually do anything with it, right? And often, we may not be in the position to enact that change ourselves, but we have to build those networks and work with the currency of how decision makers get that information in order to be influential. And then we're going to do some exercises around practicing exactly how you do that. How do you figure out who your audience is for your research? Which kinds of policymakers are you trying to target? And we're going to practice 2 key parts of a brief. So we'll actually go through the exercise of how do you craft key messages for a policy brief? What do you want them most to remember when they're kind of driving their car away at night after having read your brief? And then how do you come up with recommendations around what are the tangible actions that will come out of those briefs? So that's what we're going to cover today. But first, I want to have us go through a little chance to get to know each other. So just let me get this back up into a fuller screen. So if you could go to menti.com, and I'm sure most people, if you're not already familiar, I know this got used a lot, so people may already be familiar, but if you go to menti.com and enter the code 66259949, you'll come up to a survey or sort of set of questions. We're going to go through a little, get to know why you're here and what you're looking for. And you can do this on your device, on a smart device, if you don't want to do it in a separate window, or you can open a new browser on your laptop or however you're tuning in. And we just kind of want to get to know around what it is that you're looking for, who you are, because then I can help tailor a little bit of the stuff around things that might be more useful to you as we go on. So far, it's very much team researcher, which is not unexpected. Although we've got a student in the mix who's just like, I just want to know how this works. This is great. And we got practitioner, brave practitioner joining the bunch. That's wonderful. And so, so far we're seeing a lot of people kind of thinking about how do I take what I'm already doing and move it into policy. So we'll just wait a few more minutes. Oh, we're kind of evening out. I love the little bubbles when they show up because it makes me kind of feel like I can actually sort you into little spots. pretty much an even split, although a couple brave practitioners joining the bunch. And so the interesting part will be in building your relationships maybe after this or after you've done the field school between practitioners and people in research. Because when you combine your efforts, you'd be surprised at the things that you're used to in practice that may or may not be things that you think of as policy relevant, and vice versa with research and practice as well. So good to see. Actually, we've got lots of students here, so I'm happy that you're here as well. It's never a better time than when you're getting started to learn this stuff. So we'll let that go. And then the next question that I have for you is, what comes to mind when you think about policy? Policy kind of gets thrown around a lot as a word. We talk about it in research, in practice, in your classrooms. It's on the news all the time. But what do you think when you think of policy? And I think this is a word bubble one, so if you come up with sort of 3 words that come to mind for you: power, organizational change. These are some good ones. I'm always curious what people think policy is and isn't. And when we go through some of what the literature says in a minute, you may or may not be surprised what that comes from. Government really showing up there, practice, foundational, organizational change. I like that. Government is starting to take up a big spot in the room. Systematic change. That's a really interesting. Slow moving. Absolutely. We've got digestible change. Some interesting stuff coming up here. Must do, like requirements, things that we're required to do, cultural shift. So we kind of have few camps emerging here around people thinking this is, kind of rules and regulations. These are the thou shalts. And then we've got a camp of people that are thinking about how do we nudge or influence in a more social kind of way, in a more soft power kind of way. Then we have people thinking about the mechanics of policy. It's slow, or it's action, or it's frustrating, imperfect, incremental. These are all really wonderful ways to think about the complexity of policy, because it is all of these things. It is good and bad. It is slow. It can move very quickly, as we have seen in the last few years, and certainly in the last 24 hours. And we've seen all of the ways in which it can enable and disable our ability to do certain things that we want to see happen in our community. So thank you for sharing those with me. And you can keep putting those in there and they'll keep populating. And then when we're done, I'll share a PDF of what's all come out of that. So if you're still thinking about it, still got things to go in there, don't worry about it. Keep noodling. The next sort of set of questions I have for you is to sort of think to the degree of which you agree or disagree with these statements, which is, as researchers and practitioners, and you as students as well, do we have a moral and ethical obligation to support evidence-based policy? Are we required to actually mobilize our work? Is knowledge mobilization something that you are obligated to do in your position? Is policy always based on evidence? Even if you have that obligation, is that something that always happens? Are researchers, practitioners, and policymakers sharing the same priorities? Do we have the same goals? What's important to each of these groups? And the last question is, do we speak the same language even? So even if we share the same goals and priorities, are we able to actually talk to each other? Do you feel like you can interact with policymakers or across that spectrum in a way that you feel heard and like they feel like you hear them as well? So you should be able to rank these along the degrees that you agree or disagree, and it'd be interesting to see what kind of the temperature of the group as it is on these things. Because a lot of the time our attitudes or our feelings about whether or not policymakers will understand what we have to say, or that this is something that is part of our work rather than an add-on or a value add, but something that should be integrated into what we do. Those are different kind of positions in the academy. I know at a lot of job talks, the question is often, are you an academic or an advocate? And I always am curious about why that is split. And then this idea that policy is always based on evidence. Wanting to kind of get to know these things about how we work with each other, it's really important to think about how our approach to understanding what policy is or isn't, and our approach to how we engage with policy is framed in terms of what actually policy is. And so I'm going to surprise you here maybe a little bit and say that policy is anything that governments do or do not do. It is simply what is both action in terms of the decisions and actions that we take in order to induce a behavior or control a behavior, as well as inaction. So when we purposely decide not to do something, or even not purposely decide, but action isn't taken. But the goal is always around the maintenance of society. And so one thing that's interesting to think about is that innovative policy is kind of an oxymoron. Policy is meant to stabilize, not to disrupt. It is meant to create stability and function in a system and in a society, rather than to create this disruption. And so that's why it's often really hard to change those policy systems, because the actual machinery of policy is designed and invested in maintaining stability. And so it can be both, a purposeful form of action, or it can be a purposeful form of inaction, but it's not random and it's always goal-oriented. So the idea is that public policy consists of all of these patterns of actions or inactions that take place over time. And it's the product of both demand and supply. So it's something that people are wanting to see happen, or things that we're noticing that we need to control. And it's always in response to a pain point, right? Very little do we enact policy before there is some sort of pressure or problem. This proactive policy making can be very challenging, because you have to be in response to something and you can't respond to nothing, right? If there's nothing happening, very difficult to create the momentum needed to create a response to that. And so part of writing a policy brief is to convince decision makers that something is happening that requires attention. And then it can be done in a positive way. So when we're trying to enable or encourage things, so things like participation in particular sports, or when we're trying to correct a negative occurrence. So the things that we're seeing in such as the safe sport crisis, in terms of how do we correct that through policy decisions. But it has distinct purposes, which are, how do we resolve conflict over scarce resources, knowing that we live in a finite world? How do we regulate behavior for the outcomes that we're desiring? How do we motivate collective action around that behavior? How do you get the majority of people on board in order to pursue that outcome, while we're protecting rights, as well as making sure that those rights are not harming other rights? What is the complex web of interacting with that? And I can think of many, many examples over the last 3 years alone in which we've run into that challenge. And the goal is always to direct benefits towards the broader public interest. And so this is where we start to see challenging conversations emerge around what is the public interest. So the goal of policy then becomes purposeful action around normative goals, so things that we want to see happen or not happen, and is done by either a single actor like the state, so like the federal government or the provincial government, but increasingly by multi-level actors, which I understand from Kyle is in the environment in which sport and rec operates, right? You have multi-level governance. And so how do you coordinate the policy actions of those actors? So I'll turn it to you, Kyle, to talk a little bit about why policy matters in sport. So forward. There we go. So policy matters, is the idea, before we get to the sport application, is that it's not necessarily that policy is something that happens over here. It's not something that the government does separate from us. It's not something that is enacted on us by a foreign actor. It is something that comes out of our social obligations and our social participation. And one of the challenges when we're thinking about policy is that the quality of our institutions and the quality of our policymaking actually determine our collective fortune over time. So it's not necessarily that you're well endowed with resources if those resources are not well managed, if they're not governed by good policy and not everybody is engaged in that act, then it's not necessarily going to lead to the good outcome that we're looking for. And that policy matters because it is actually a collective agreement, is the thing that we all agree to participate in together. Sorry, again, now over to you, Kyle, for why policy matters for sport.
No problem. Thank you so much. Yeah, we just want to take a second here to kind of step back and contextualize this a little bit. A lot of what's kind of pulled us all in here is, a concern or an interest in sport and likely sport policy. People may or may not be super familiar with sport policy and what it looks like and how it's enacted. So I wanted to just give a bit of context information for the Canadian context specifically. If you're joining from somewhere else, this is just helpful to understand what we're looking at, where we're coming from, but know that these contextual things and policies in different places will be different in different places. So those of us who have been following sport in Canada, you'll know that this has been a pretty exciting year in terms of things that are happening and stuff that people are watching very closely. So this year, anyone who's been following the Hockey Canada issues that have been playing out have really highlighted the kind of complexity and the tensions within our Canadian sports system. So we do have a federal or federated sports system, meaning that we have an arm of government, Sport Canada, who oversees sport. And then below that, we have levels of national, provincial, and then municipal or regional organizations that also are involved in various aspects of sport. So whether it's elite development or grassroots participation or supporting different sports around specific issues. So for example, we have multi-sport service organizations like Canadian Women in Sport, the Aboriginal Sports Circle, the Sport Information Resource Center, who support multiple sports in different ways. So we do have this multi-level system of governance, so meaning we have different levels of organizations. And in sport, it's interesting because they kind of exist in both the public and private sector and the nonprofit sector. So we've got many kind of different actors playing in different ways, organizations with very different levels of capacity or knowledge of policy systems and how to impact on them. And what this means is it just creates this really complex web of actors in sport. And so while some of us may be involved in grassroots community sport, that policy there will look very different than it does at a national sport organization. And folks at a national sport organization will still think very differently than someone at Sport Canada, who has kind of maybe more of these organizations in their scope or in their system that they're thinking about. One thing that I think is important to highlight is in sport in Canada, I think we do have a pretty good relationship between researchers, practitioners, and policymakers, and we have some good mechanisms established to communicate some of this stuff. So for those of you who are familiar with the Sport Information Resource Center or the Sport Participation Research Initiative, that is an organization where they're really all about knowledge translation, all about connecting researchers and practitioners and policymakers. And there is a concerted effort to make that happen. And I will say that's likely not the case everywhere. I think it's, we're pretty fortunate to have that structure and to have those opportunities to build those relationships and to do those things. So just an important kind of caveat to put there that this is, I do really think this is an important resource to highlight and to note that those relationships are out there. The other interesting thing that makes, I think, this session really timely is we're currently in the process of renewing Canadian sport policy. So for anyone who attended the Sport Participation Research Initiative conference a couple weeks ago, one of their sessions was on the draft of the new policy document and what that will look like. So we're at a time now where we're in this renewal process. Early next year, we should see the completed document. I think actually it's next week they're doing the more testing focus groups and conversations that they're doing. So if you are interested in that, you can find that information on the Sport Information Resource Center website. And that policy will, essentially it is the 10-year strategic plan for the federal sport system in Canada. So it's a really interesting and exciting time. And I will just say, participating in that session a couple of weeks ago really highlighted for me the complexity of these different levels of government and what people look to a policy for and are expecting. There was one person who I think worked at a kind of like a regional sport organization who was talking about wanting to see a policy that they could pick up and use and know what to do with. And I was like, oh, that's really interesting, because I don't think of this high level national policy, this strategic plan for the country for 10 years to be something that someone in a grassroots club could necessarily pick up and put into practice, like a specific facility policy or something like that. So I had a good discussion with my class who was attending about these different levels of policymakers and what they're concerned with and what policy does and for whom. So I'm not sure I clarified much in this slide, but I think the point was to really highlight the complexity of this and what it looks like. And as we move through the session today, we'll talk a bit more about focusing in on your specific audience and who your policy audience is going to be. And I think in this big complex system system, that's really, really important there. So building on that, we can flip to the next slide there. I'm going to kind of shift focus now and get us talking a little bit about policy briefs. So what is a policy brief? A policy brief can be many things, and it can be useful for many different people. Essentially, Ashley's going to get more into this in a little bit, but a policy brief is kind of a concise summary of an issue that brings together opinions and recommendations in a succinct way for a succinct person or group of people. So those policymakers or those decision makers. We can think about these in different ways. So people might have read them from different places. Sometimes you'll see, a big long policy brief that's 20 pages long and includes many, many sources of evidence and many, many recommendations that might be described more like a roadmap for action or advocacy. And then you can also see very, very succinct ones that argue for very specific actions in specific ways. So one way to think about this distinction is one as an advocacy brief. So one that advocates for a very specific action and the way forward that we want to see. And then another being an objective brief, where it provides many options for action or different directions that we can take. So depending on the message you're trying to get across, or depending on your audience and what they may be most receptive to, you can think about some of these different ways of framing a brief. The important kind of distinction to make here is between a policy brief and what we can call a briefing note. So often, if you work in policy, if you work for a level of government, you might be tasked with creating a briefing note. So I use my students for this. If I'm not able to attend a virtual event, I will sign a student up and I'll say, hey, student, I need you to go attend this, and I want you to take really good notes and tell me what the important things were, who the key speakers were, and what the takeaways are. So essentially, that is a briefing note, right? You're getting a succinct summary of information, but generally the briefing note, we're talking more about a relationship between two people. So it's very specific. It's between two people with a specific objective, and we're kind of working together on this. Whereas a policy brief can be a bit more broad. It can be something that we develop for different audiences that we're sending out to, or it could be sent out to maybe a range of people in a similar role, or published completely publicly, right? So out there for the public to engage in different ways. So just kind of complicating this further, but there's both internal and external facing briefs. So we can think about this. We're really thinking about who our audience is, who it's for. But generally, when we're talking about a brief, it usually has a specific audience, right? It's not for just anyone all the time. It usually has a specific kind of person you're targeting it for. And usually it's about bringing complex information, that could be research information or different kinds of data, and making it digestible and usable for someone who isn't necessarily a specialist. So if you're an expert, you're a specialist in this area of research or policy, your brief should be written in a way that's accessible to someone who's not as a specialist or expert as you. So with that, I'll turn it over to Ashley, and she's going to talk a little bit more about these briefs and what they can look like.
Thanks, Kyle. And it's interesting when we talk about these terms, and I teach this material and so myself as well. And I always kind of bristle a little bit at the objective versus advocacy, because I don't believe objectivity exists, because you're always writing these for a purpose, right? You're always advocating for a particular reason. Otherwise, why write the darn thing in the first place? So the interesting thing to think about there, that I'll add to Kyle's wonderful kind of description of the difference between a policy brief and a briefing note, is that one is something that you are giving to someone, and one is something that is requested of you. So a policy brief is often something that you are generating for a purpose that you're trying to influence, whereas a briefing note is more transactional. Think of when a minister, for example, is asking their staff to say, there's this issue, I've heard about it on CBC. I need to know what the issue is and what I should do to respond to it, or I'm looking for this issue. What should we do about this kind of thing? So it's being requested for you to kind of generate a response for something, versus a policy brief, which is generally more about informing somebody that may or may not know about that issue, may or may not have asked for it, and that you're advancing an agenda that way. So one is sort of pushing forward versus one is sort of delivering onto something that was requested. And that's usually a good way to kind of find a distinction between the two. And Kyle gave a really good example there around saying, I want you to go do X so that I can get the information and do Y, versus one is saying, we've identified this issue and we need you to do something about it, whether or not somebody asked for it or not. So thinking about it in that way helps kind of separate out what the task at hand is. So digging into that a little bit more, as we can think about policy briefs as sort of like the currency of how we do policy development, right? How do you get an issue in front of someone? How do you get someone to care about the thing that you know is really important, but may not be getting oxygen, or something that is getting so much coverage and there's so much noise that people really don't know how to respond or what to do? And so the idea is to really concisely drive home what the topic is or what the problem is, what the person that you're talking to needs to know about that topic, and what they should do about it. So it's action oriented in terms of how do you want people to respond once they've read your policy brief. And note that these may or may not be elected officials, right? We tend to think of policy as only being a thing that is done by, say, the Minister of Sport and Recreation, right? Or by the Minister of Agriculture. I'm a rural policy person, so I think in those terms. And I'm jealous of your effective relationships in that regard, because rural policy is sort of fairly nebulous and we have a hard time getting a foothold. And so the idea that you can find actors that influence policy in surprising ways. So there may be a deputy minister, there may be a particularly influential partner. So some of your organizations that you work with are practitioners who have a lot of influence over what decision makers do. And you may want to target them as your audience because they may take that forward to the decision maker. So it's not necessarily always elected officials, but the goal is always to convince the reader that there is a problem that is important and must be dealt with now. It's not something that can wait. It's something that needs urgent attention, because otherwise it'll just sit on somebody's desk, right? The idea that you have a clear purpose and audience, and you have material for saying, here's what you're going to do about it now that you've read my urgent request for action. It can be an effective tool for translating research and knowledge into action, but that requires us to do more than sort of say, as I said earlier, right at the end of a research paper, then this has implications for public policy. You have to spell it out for policymakers. What are those implications? What are the costs of implementing this? What are the opportunities? How are, exactly as your practitioner said, you know, what am I going to do with this big 10-year strategic plan? What does this mean for me? How am I going to put it into action? And it should be designed in order to improve decision-making around that action by aligning what you know from practice and research, from the evidence, from seeing what's happening, to implementation. So it's an exercise in what I call pragmatic persuasion. You want to be able to persuade people to see things from your point of view as a practitioner or researcher and with your knowledge in pragmatic ways, rather than just sort of the charm of like, you should listen to me. Okay, you should listen to me and you should do what I say because it has practical implications. They can also be used for advocacy or just raising awareness. So not all policy briefs will have a direct sort of action in terms of tomorrow you will do X, but they may have, it's important for you to know about this issue and here's where you learn more and why we need to develop competency around a particular topic. So this is around identifying and proposing alternative forms of action. So what would we do or not do, going back to that definition of policy? Maybe it is about stopping an action. Maybe it's about saying the action is to do inaction. We need to pull back from a particular way of doing things, but it should be based on evidence. It should be based on what is happening and changing what is happening to something more preferable, that normative goal. And this is always a little bit tricky sometimes, I think, particularly for researchers to think about that pragmatic implications, because sometimes the evidence we have is really challenging to move into action. It requires wholesale shifts in mindset. Sometimes it requires an entirely different way of thinking about what counts as evidence. So we think a lot in terms of policy circles right now. I know, I'm sure you've heard this to death, you know, the neoliberalization of policy in terms of thinking in terms of fiscal policy, marketization, thinking in terms of numbers is the only kind of evidence, large quantitative data sets, those kinds of sets of evidence, very traditional ways of thinking about what counts as evidence. But we also need to challenge what that means when we start thinking about stories and lived experience and how do people navigate systems? What does that look like? And sometimes you may have a small data set, but it's critical evidence. So maybe there are only 12 people that have knowledge or insight or experience of a particular phenomenon, but that's still a robust and rigorous piece of evidence that needs to be explored. And so part of this challenge of writing good briefs or thinking the way through this is making sure that you find a way to communicate that your evidence or what you're using is something that people should count on, right? What makes your data worth listening to? And so it should be credible and legible to decision makers in a way that they can digest and understand and put into practice. And this is always really interesting to me, kind of living in the weird liminal space between policymaking and research, is that the thing that works for a lot of policy analysts or for people that are doing the machinery of government is often that very, kind of neoliberal approach to data, very quantitative based, large data sets, statistics, those kinds of things. But the things that work with politicians are often anecdotes, stories, narratives, things that have a compelling thing that they can tell to their constituencies or to themselves or to their teammates in caucus that have an impact, right? And we know that stories have an impact. So you should always try to pair the two together. What does your data say? What is the story that comes through? And do you have an actual lived experience or a story from practice that you can really illustrate what some of that broader, more quantitative data says, and vice versa? How do you pair those so that they give compelling reasons and in effect, kind of close off avenues for not being believed or not being trusted in terms of what you're presenting forward? But we do know that those anecdotes, those stories are really powerful. And I'll give you one example of this. Is in my previous life, in my own experience of doing this, is we've written lots and lots of great notes around sort of projects around innovation in the community, kind of broadband-based development, all these kinds of things. And those landed a bit. Those were important. They were received as important from our decision makers. But what really had a turnaround impact on their buy-in into the projects that we were doing was when we were able to get a bit of airtime with CBC Ontario Morning. We were able to do an interview about the work that we were doing. And all of a sudden, everybody got it, right? It was something that they heard through a conversation. It was the same information that we've been sharing. But then you had this broader audience and you were able to sort of use that story and use that broader buy-in that someone else thought it was exciting, that then started to generate internal energy. And so this is sort of thinking about your different audiences and how you might get at them and what might be interesting and compelling to them. And we'll talk about it in a little bit, but this is why we're seeing the power of things like Instagram, 10-slide carousels that are actually policy briefs. We're seeing whole TikTok videos that are breaking down things like the labor movement and why things like Bill 28 are dangerous for labor rights. And so we're seeing these different tools that are just as compelling as a 3 to 5 pager and use the same data, but are presented differently. And so it's thinking about what suits the need you want to accomplish. They can be written by literally anybody, think tanks, academics, political advisors, policy advocates. It doesn't matter. You can write a policy brief no matter what your position is, and you can get it forward in interesting ways. And I think that's sort of a really great democratization of policy right now, is that we have a lot of people that are able to get into that space. Comes with lots of complexity and some challenges, but I think it's pushing an interesting thing forward around where does policy advice come from? Who do we listen to? What counts as evidence? So these are all interesting things to kind of keep in the back of your head as you're thinking about your own work, right? What compelling story do I tell in my research or in my practice? What are the really important pain points, pressure points, or really great opportunities, things that we're seeing that are happening that are really, really good, that need more oxygen, that need more support? And then how do I tell a good story about that that will make people care and make people think, yeah, I want to do something about that because it is such a compelling story. So we've got a couple examples, and these are actually in a Google Drive folder that I will also put the link in here as well. Sorry, I just got to move this around. Where are we here? Zoom is in the way here. So I just wanted to show you a couple of examples of what policy briefs, the traditional policy brief, could look like. And one, I'm pandering to my audience a little bit here, kind of with a Brock example. But we have sort of a very traditional example of what a policy brief could look like. And so you'll notice up front, you have a very simple title, and you want to play, be a bit clever to put some urgency in that title, but it should be immediately clear to the reader what they're looking at and what they could expect to find in the brief. So you see here, Parks and Recreation as an essential service. And then you get into the more academic-y, using a health equity lens to strengthen provision in Niagara. That's a little bit more dense for some people, but that first one really hits you over the head with what you're expected to read in that brief. I won't go through the details of what's in the content, but I'll show you the clear highlight of what the introduction is. You can read all the information sort of in one section on that first page, and sort of a bit more context. And you have this call out quote, right, of something that you really want to hammer home. So you've got sort of pull out information around what the issues are that you're covering, what the summary of what is the triple threat, so to speak. You'll also notice that it's pretty, right? It looks nice. It's something that invites you in, that sort of catches your attention. The use of red is really, really like attractive. It sort of inspires this sense of, we have a psychological response to colors, things like red. So it inspires you or encourages you to pay closer attention. Then we have things like diagrams, right? So this is a really great way of networking, sort of visualizing for decision makings or people, what all the different players are and who's involved and how can you make sense of what that network is. And that's a lot easier to get your hands around than a long written explanation that can accompany it, but this sort of facilitates that downwards. And again, you'll notice it's visually appealing. It's something you can digest and take away. It's also something that you can rip out of this brief and take with you. So there should be things that you can separate that are easy takeaways for people, that if they need to reference it later, they have it right in front of them. You'll also see, I'll go through, I want to just get down to the one, you got lots of pictures and all these things. This is a more academic one. So it's got things like vignettes and lots of stories. When we're talking about, again, that sort of narrative things, vignettes are a good tool as well, because they sort of contextualize the broader problem into something specific. And a vignette is just, for those that may not be familiar with that terminology, is just sort of taking a microcosm or a small selection that is typical or exemplifies the issue that you're talking about and how you might want to solve it or what the remaining issues are, using an actual piece of example or a piece of evidence. You also have some more data, things like that, but this is sort of a longer style brief. And you can see this, it's also going to be shared with you later, and you can go into some more depth with that. I want to show you a different one that this is a little bit self-serving. This is one I've created. And again, you'll see it's red, it's visually compelling. You have, a first page that says, what is the goal? We're connecting rural Canada. This is about broadband. What are local governments? What can they do in it? And it sort of lays out in the first page what the issue is and what local governments can do. So my goal with there was to sort of have hit people over the head on that first page with what is the problem? What can you do about it? And what can you do about right now? So if they don't even get past the first page, at least they got something, right? They got the core messages of things. And that's why it's sometimes important to think about putting those key messages right up at the front. You may want to start with your key messages and your recommendations as a tearaway cover page, so that even if somebody that doesn't have time or hasn't generated enough interest yet, they get everything right away, right off the hop. Later in this document, I provide that context for things. So you say labeling the sections exactly what they are. This is not the time for clever in terms of trying to hide things. You want to be very direct and clear about what you're doing. The other thing is, again, that context. Why are we talking about this? Why is it important? But the other thing I want to get to is exactly this one pager that says, here are your 3 policy options. Here's what I would like you to do, with the top line being that one liner that says specifically a direction, right? So we need to ensure that broadband infrastructure is included in official plans, strategic plans, and all of those kinds of things. That's what you should do. And then it goes into more reasons why. So these are sort of examples more of that traditional style of doing a brief. The other thing, that we can talk about is that, there we go, is that beyond those, and you'll see this later, is that thinking about what would that look like as one page. So increasingly in the policy environment, particularly when you're dealing with people like deputy ministers, cabinet, people at a very high level that are tasked with a lot of decisions at high volume and high impact, we're increasingly seeing calls for what's called a placemat, which is essentially that you would include all of that information on a single 8.5 by 11 piece of paper and put it usually landscape, and think about how you would use that essentially like an academic poster, but much more direct, much clearer, and includes sort of what are the messages, what are the recommendations, and where do you go to find more information. But everything should be on that single one page. And I've included an example in the files that you'll get at the end of this workshop. Something more interesting, as I said earlier, that I'm really enjoying is this idea around using Instagram or digital tools or sort of these other ways around how we engage with policy briefs. And I'm just going to bring up this the slides from the On Canada project, because these circulate a lot, at least in my circles. I see these a lot being shared in Instagram stories and people's posts when issues come up that are sort of hot topics in the news. And what we're seeing here is a policy brief, right? Here is this problem statement. Minimum wage should be a livable wage. And you click over, whoops, it's a little sweary, but you have these kind of policy briefs that will often use a 10 carousel information deck that gives you, what is a recession? What do I need to know about the issue? And then what have we got wrong about dealing with a recession? And then how do you know what's happening? What did, businesses make cuts, unemployment and underemployment, affordability is impacted. So these are policy briefs, right? These are policy briefs in terms of what's causing, why you should pay attention. And I think that we sometimes discount them as influential, but the degree to which these are shared in the broader public shows that they are very impactful. And we saw a lot of that around the organization recently this week. We've seen a lot of it in terms of the organization around pandemic policy. And I think we've seen a lot of it as well around the safe sport crisis in terms of how that message has been disseminated into the broader public. So when we think about using those different formats, the most important thing to think about is how will the information be shared, right? How are you going to get this into the hands of the people that will use it? And what are they most likely to respond to? And so, a deputy minister and an assistant deputy minister may or may not be more or less receptive to an Instagram reel or to an Instagram carousel than they would to a traditional 3 to 5 pager that's on a written document. But you also never know, right? You never know, because these things do happen. I've had lots of conversations with senior government officials who have said things they hear on the radio when they're driving to work are often just as impactful as a brief that lands on their desk. And so you need to think about how will that information get to the decision maker? Part of that is knowing who is your audience? Like, who are you wanting to influence? Is it the federal government? Is it the provincial government? Is it a municipal government? Is it a sport organization body, a university, the general public? Thinking about who it is that's most important to have this information and who can do something about it is really important. And what do they need? What do they like? What kind of gets them excited? What are they interested in seeing come across their desk? How will you differentiate yourself and your brief from all of the other briefs that land on a desk? And tell you that landing your 200-page thesis or dissertation or even a 20-page journal article is not likely to cut it. So how are you going to differentiate your work from everything else that may land on their desk? And you can triangulate, right? You're not limited to just saying, I'm going to do just the 3 to 5 pager. It's always wise to think about, how will I develop a suite of materials that I can use in different settings with different actors, particularly when, in discussing with Kyle before this event, in a multi-level governance environment like the one that you operate in, you need to have that sort of triangulation for all the players so that everybody is getting the information in the way they need, but they're starting to think about it at the same time. And they're all sort of coalescing pressure around the same issue at the same time. So developing that suite of products that you can put out becomes really useful. I'm just going to pause for a second and just ask if anybody has any questions, or if you want to put your hand up. I see things in the chat, but I can't. I think if I open them, everyone will see them because I'm sharing the whole screen. But if anybody wanted to put up their hand or had questions at this point, I know it's been fairly dense up till now, so I just wanted to pause.
We did have one question popped in a few minutes ago. That was, should we be including this stuff in our manuscripts as well? Like you talked about these like different formats. So I just threw in there that it's, it's an audience. We were talking a little bit about audience, right? And I think when we tend to talk to other academics, we look for like many small pieces of knowledge that build up to a big body of knowledge that's clear and robust. Whereas these we're looking for very direct, like this is the way forward. Whereas I think in academic writing, we're often quite hesitant to talk about, this is what we need to do because our data is often backwards looking, right? We're looking at what has happened. We can't accurately predict what will happen if we do something differently. So it's tough to make that as a firm recommendation, but I'd love to know your thoughts on that, if you have creative ways of working this stuff in as well.
Yeah, and this is sort of a byproduct of my own career and upcoming, is that I always think about, so what, right? I'm doing this work, so what? What is the point of doing the research if it's not to advance some particular goal? It's really nice to generate new knowledge, but if we're just generating it for the sake of generating it without actually thinking about how it will be applied and enacted and implemented, then really we're just kind of doing it for ourselves. And I think that it's useful to think about upfront, what will be the impact of doing this work? And not all research is necessarily policy relevant, but we should be thinking about, how is it relevant? What will it impact? What is the goal? What is the so what of it? And a useful thing is thinking about, when I'm done this project, what will I want people to do with this information? And when we think about what will I want people to do with this information, it becomes a lot clearer to think about how we advance that knowledge into practice. And you can design your publication goals or the things that you want to do as outputs around those. And often, I think probably a lot of us have seen this, knowledge mobilization gets tacked on as the last thing on a research proposal, and then we'll do knowledge mobilization. And I argue that that should be upfront. That should be the very first thing we think about when we're designing research. It should be, then what am I going to do with it, no matter what comes out of it? And second to that, I'll add, we're really bad at policy evaluation in Canada. We spend a lot of money, we create a lot of pilots, we create a lot of programs, and we almost never go back to say, and then what happened? We almost never evaluate policy outcomes or policy spending, because we like to say, I've spent X number of dollars on one of my former portfolios, broadband. We spent billions and billions of dollars on broadband and have never once actually evaluated if it has done what it was supposed to do. And so I think particularly when we're thinking about what you're talking about, Kyle, a lot of it is backward looking. Something that is important as part of that is saying, how do you build in that evaluation of, like, did it work? Did what we tried to do with that policy or that initiative, how will we know that anybody's better off, is a really important part of doing that policy things. And writing briefs about that are just as valuable as the forward facing, here's what you should do next, is about saying, here's what we did, and this is what tells us about what should come next and what we know about that. It's also really brave to do evaluatory work. It's often difficult to get into the hands of people, particularly decision makers, because it highlights warts and all, what we've done and what we didn't do. So for me, it's really important to think about, again, so what, and then is anybody better off? And that's a really useful thing to think about when we're thinking about our research, particularly for most of us that work in publicly funded institutions. Those are public dollars. We're beholden or responsible to the community and the public and the people we work with. So thinking about that as impact is really helpful. Is there any other questions that we're kicking around? No? All right, well, we'll keep steaming through. All right. Also, you'll notice I really love Parks and Rec, and I felt it was appropriate for this talk. So when we get into the nuts and bolts of writing briefs, this kind of might seem a little bit a very, very 101 kind of way of approaching this. And this is also included in a set of worksheets, so you'll get his takeaway home. So don't worry about kind of trying to capture all this in a hurry. It's really fascinating to me how often a lot of these very core things are missed in policy briefs. So just what is the problem? Often people will say this is an issue without identifying, why the issue matters and what is the actual issue. And I think if you're a student, you probably struggled this in terms of what's your thesis statement, right? Like what's the problem? What am I writing about? And drilling down into something as specific as you possibly can. And you want to talk about, why is it relevant? How did we get here? What are the causes? What are the outcomes? What do we know about the current known situation? And then you get into, what evidence do we have about that? And what implications have we already seen play out when we're getting into the body of it? What interventions have happened elsewhere, particularly at the municipal level? In Canada, we like to do a lot of what is affectionately called R&D, rob and deploy, in terms of we like to take initiatives that are happening in one jurisdiction and apply them elsewhere. As a place-based researcher, I'm always frustrated by that, because we know that doesn't often work, right? So just because someone else did it in this community doesn't mean it necessarily will work here. And so we need to be cognizant of that. And then what are the examples of successful change? What do we want to see happen? But also, where has it failed? Where do we know that things have gone wrong? Your recommendations, and I want to focus on this really tightly, never ever put into a policy brief, or into a briefing note for that matter either, recommendations that you do not want to see have happened. And I've seen this happen with a few climate briefs recently, where they'll talk about, here is an option, the do nothing option, and here's what happens. And I know that that's intended to sort of see the example of failure, but you're giving it out. You're giving it out to say, here is sort of the realistic picture of if you do this sort of less preferred option. Every time you include a potential recommendation or policy recommendation, you should be cognizant of the fact that they may actually do that. So if you include recommendations that aren't truly aligned with what you want to see happen, there's a big danger there that might be the one they pick. Usually when we write briefs, we usually frame those recommendations as the one that we would love to see happen, the pie in the sky. If we had all the resources possible and everybody was on board, then you have sort of the middle of the road option in terms of, the more realistic scenario, what would be the sort of minimal viable product. And then we have an option that is sort of some change, but is a little bit more pragmatic for people to wrap their heads around. And I really struggle with that because I think we should focus on the things that we want to see happen. Otherwise, you're sort of creating noise, right? You're creating noise in the system by giving the things of like, well, you could do this, but we really wish you wouldn't. You don't have time or space in something this short to give those kinds of things. So focus on what are the considerations that need to happen. These have to be kind of put in the context of what will it cost, both in terms of dollars, but organizational change is expensive in social capital as well. Who's going to lose if we do this? And somebody always loses. So be cognizant of when you're framing your recommendations that everyone will win, because even in things that we see recommendations around, say, the circular economy, those are usually framed as everybody will win. And the thing is that somebody will lose. Companies that, get away with low taxation or don't have to pay for their climate impact, or who benefit in some way from the status quo, they will lose something. And so how do you manage and mitigate that loss? And what does it mean to do that? Even if it's an acceptable loss to you from your position, it's still a loss that needs to be addressed. And so you should always be prepared for that. Also be prepared for what isn't being said in your policy brief. When you're aware of what the content is, someone will challenge you in terms of like, but what about this? So you should be prepared for those kinds of things. And then finally, this idea around make it look nice. I think sometimes we don't put enough energy or emphasis into the palatability of policy briefs, and they need to be something that catches your attention, that can be read quickly and digested quickly so that then you can move on to more action. This isn't about giving the entire known universe on an issue. It's about drilling down to something very specific. So make sure that your titles are short and sweet and direct and actually convey what you need, that you have good graphic content. And there are lots of free tools out there now. I use Canva a lot for things, but you can also use PowerPoint to design really beautiful one-pagers. You can use things like Publisher, or even if you're Adobe familiar, go for it. But there's lots of free tools that allow you to be able to do this. So the content around the mechanics of how this works are really about setting, what's the problem? What do we know about it? Here's what you should do about it, and then making it look good. And figuring out how you're going to frame that. And once you have your content in play, in terms of what you want to see happen, then you can think about those formats around, does this make sense around this kind of product for, say, an Instagram 10 slide carousel, or does it, how does this look in a 3 to 5 pager? But the key message is you have a lot of room to be creative in this. You have a lot, there's no sort of set structure in terms of what needs to be done, but there are set elements in terms of what is most impactful for the reader. So the way that you get started with doing this is sort of, there's 6 key steps to getting started. And the idea is that zoom out to that big picture. Why does this matter? Why should anybody care? That so what factor. And I know we all think that everybody should care about our own particular slice of research, and it's very important to us. But one of the things that we need to think about is, if I wasn't me, or what do my colleagues care about? What are the people around me? Why should this matter to them? And why should they care in terms of an audience? What is this impact in their day-to-day life? What will this alleviate for them? Or what kind of stressor will this create for them? From there, distill your message into the most important thing. Should really drill down at no more than 3 key messages, really, for most policy briefs. 5 is pushing it. 1 is preferable. Plan your brief by gathering all of your evidence, get your recommendations in play, kind of think through all of those pieces before you begin to put it into whatever format. Think about implementation really seriously. So it's important to say, like, why does this matter? why should you care? What's my message? And then say, how are you going to do something about it? What are the timelines? I like that example Kali gave around, the 10-year strategic plan versus something I can pick up and walk away and do something with. You need to be able to play in that space and be able to do that. That's when you start writing. You don't start writing first. The writing comes after we gathered all this stuff. And then the format comes from that, because it'll emerge, right? As you're putting things together, it starts to make sense what this makes the most sense to put into place. The key part around that is also, what do I want to do with it? Am I just going to put this out there, or am I going to campaign with it? Am I going to be behind this and advancing it in a very active part of this? Or is this something I'm going to post on a website and send a link to, say, on Twitter or on LinkedIn, and not really sort of babysit over time? That will determine a lot of the format and the content as well. How actively involved you want to be in the process of managing your brief. So we're gonna, if people want to take like the 2 seconds to grab a drink of water, I'm gonna run you through what we're gonna do right now, which is that before we take a little break for a drink of water, because I know it's been a dense thing, is that we're gonna practice preparing a brief. So I thought it was really important that we actually kind of get our hands around this, because it's all well and good for me to kind of be esoteric and say, this is what policy is, and here's what briefs can look like and stuff. But you will find when you get down in the nitty gritty, and I'm sure if you've already done this a couple of times, you found that the practice of it is far more frustrating than what it sounds like until this point. And so practicing drafting briefs helps you think about how you might use your own work. And so we're going to give you a scenario that isn't necessarily your research, but it helps you think through the process. And this is also important for students in the room who may be thinking about going into policy work. You will be often asked or handed an issue saying, I need to know about this, or we need you to draft something about this, and you might not know anything about it, and you will have to go and find out. And so think about this, less is about the content and more about the process of doing this. So we're going to use an example that's somewhat fictitious, but is inspired by reality to help you create the 3 most critical parts of a brief: mapping your audience, crafting your key messages, and preparing some potential recommendations. So I'm going to just pop this link in the chat. And then if folks want to take like, I don't know, Kyle, like 5 minutes for just like a quick little bio break, and we'll come back and we'll dive into the exercise together. Although there will be times in your life, particularly if you're writing briefing notes, where someone may say something like this at you and then say, go write. And you will find yourself scrambling just a little bit in order to do that. So always a good skill sometimes to develop, but we won't do that to you now. But the scenario we've come up with is one that I understand from Kyle is sort of a bit of a hot topic in the sport literature, as well as this idea around public funding for stadiums. And we've seen a few of these go on in the last little while, one in Edmonton. Currently, there's a lot of debate over what I still call the Sky Dome. I cannot call it the Rogers Center to save my life. And we're seeing this process around the argument that it's an economic development project, that city, federal, municipal, and provincial governments should invest in this. So there's a lot of sort of powerful voices that lobby for public funding to be allocated to money. So in this case, we're talking about the Sky Dome or the Rogers Center, and they're advocating for public investment in it, or potentially they may leave. They may build somewhere else outside of the city. They may go somewhere else entirely. That's often something we see happen. However, we know from the research that the costs of public investment in these facilities often far outweighs any benefit in terms of economic development, employment, tourism spending. But this is counterintuitive to a lot of public officials who say, well, we'll build a facility. Of course, people will come. Of course, there will be jobs. Of course, there will be events. And what we see what actually happens is that that's balanced by people going to other cities for tourism and for events as well. So it's sort of a net neutral in terms of people coming in versus people coming out. We may see a novel impact for the first 2 or 3 years, but then it really dies off. And we often do not actually see a stimulus of new spending, and the jobs that created are often seasonal, precarious, or otherwise not as supportive to community development as they are argued to be. In this scenario, Rogers Communications and its partners are requesting $200 million in public investment for a renovation of the Sky Dome. They want $100 million from each of the provincial and federal governments and $50 million from the City of Toronto. You know that this is a delicate issue, that people have entrenched positions on this, regardless of what the research says. It balances big money and powerful players. So going back to that first word cloud around what is policy, and somebody noted power is a big part of this, as well as public sentiment and people's love for their sport team, or also kind of concern around spending. And this does not necessarily support public investment. So your mission, should you choose to accept it, is to convey to policymakers how to make a potentially unpopular decision and not spend public dollars on this project. So the first thing that we're going to do as part of responding to this scenario is we're going to map your audience. So you're going to be assigned to breakout rooms, and the group number will correspond to the groups that are listed here. So the group 1 will deal with Minister St. Onge, group 2 will deal with Minister McLeod, group 3 with Mayor John Tory, and group 4, so the media, the broader public, in terms of thinking about what that audience is. You want to sort of think about what is an archetype of this kind of audience? What's their persona? Are you thinking about an amalgam of their key characteristics as a federal cabinet minister, as well as them personally? Who are they? What matters to them? What are their pain points? Who are their key partners? Who are their, I say enemies in this, but adversaries may be a less charged word. What do they need help with in order to succeed in their role and to, for all intents and purposes, come out looking good, right? You want them to take a particular action while recognizing that they have needs. So we're going to put you into some breakout groups, and there will be a worksheet there as well that helps you work through mapping your audience. And we're going to give you about 10 minutes to to go through mapping your audience. And so I think, Vivian, if we can open up the breakout groups and send people, what was this experience like for you? What was it like to map this audience, to think of what your assigned sort of audience, whether it's federal, provincial, municipal, or the broader public, how difficult was that for you to put yourself in the position of that decision maker? Or what surprised you about what came up around things you thought that they might need? Were you cynical about what their needs would be? Were you hopeful and more excited about what they thought? Emily, I see a hand up there.
Great, thanks. I just wanted to share briefly, and this came up in our chat as well in our breakout room, that kind of the dissonance or challenges when you are involved in writing a policy brief or some kind of policy messaging, and you're not actually behind the message that you want to, that you have to disseminate. I'm not saying that's the case per se in this here, but definitely with many of the things communicated through policy, there's some challenges for me personally in my lived experience of that. So that came up initially in our discussion before moving to the nitty-gritty.
Totally. Yeah. Putting yourself in the position of, I may not agree with what they're going to need, but this is definitely something that they will want to hear or not want to hear, right? That's very difficult. So that's a great insight. Tammy?
Yeah, and I was in the same group. We jumped ahead a little bit.
Yeah, you're keeners, group 1.
Yeah. Well, no, I was in group 2, but it was just to sort of put your head in their space. So for instance, if you're not online with their ideology, because we're dealing with governments, right, and administrations, and their sort of like their political ideology, like really thinking about what messages or who you would actually go to as a gatekeeper to get that information to them. So who does the minister rely on for their information? That, to me, that would almost be the person that you would have to tackle, because they're the ones that have to convince the minister. But then going on to key messages, if you're dealing with in a political administration that you're not familiar with their ideologies or on par with their ideologies, how do I put the language in a way that it's going to benefit them or that they're going to understand?
Yeah, that's really interesting. And I just want to highlight there that often we put ourselves in an adversarial position when we do audience mapping. We sort of assume that someone is going to have different thoughts, ideas, goals, or desires than we do. And I really want to pause here and say that regardless of governing body or big P politics, the ministers, assistant, and then the civic administration, so civil service, often has exactly the same goals that we do. They want to see successful programs happen. They want to see successful investment in communities. They want to see things go well. And so I think it's really, really important when we're doing this exercise of audience mapping is to try as much as we possibly can to not think of these audiences as the enemy. because they're not. They're people that we want to work with as partners. They need to be good colleagues. Now, we don't always like our partners and colleagues on the level of, I want to go share dinner and spend, a weekend in Niagara on the Lake with them. But we do have similar goals in terms of wanting to see things work well and wanting to see good outcomes from the investments that we're making. And so something that I would encourage as you're walking away from this workshop is, what is it about my experience or my assumptions, more likely, about my audience that puts me into this adversarial role with them right from the hop, rather than thinking about, are they my partner? How do I think of them as a co-conspirator, regardless of what I assume they may or may not be like? So this is a really good exercise in thinking about, how much am I bringing in what I know to be true versus what I'm assuming or imagining or telling a story about these particular actors. So in the interest of time, I'm just going to let folks say, if there's any more lingering thoughts or whatever, maybe pop them in the chat. It's really good to reflect on that, right? To think about what we assume about our audience versus what is actually in fact true and what we know of those relationships. And it's a good thing to think about. And so some of you have also, as you said, jumped ahead to the next part, which is really great. I don't think I can, it's not letting me, there we go. Share my screen again here. Is we want to see this next part, and we're going to take about 20 minutes to do this. And now the Jamboard is open and you know what to do. There was a few little glitches there, and that's on my fault. So thank you for your patience. As I want you to sort of take that, knowing what you're sort of percolating on about your audience, spend some time and think about, what do you want them to remember about reading a brief that this might be about? What is most important that as they're walking away from their meeting, as they're having a shower the next morning, as they're eating their breakfast, that you really want them to think about? And then what do you want them to do for the recommendations? What is the thing that's most important that they take an action on, or in this case, don't take an action on, and the justification for why that should be? So we're going to put you back into the same, I think they'll all be the same breakout groups, and sort of work on those issues for the next sort of 20 minutes or so. That'll take us right up to time, and we'll take a few minutes to debrief at the end. We may call you back a little bit earlier because I think folks have kind of gone through that a little bit as we're thinking through these things. But we'll put you all, Vivian, if we can put folks back. What were people's reflections on, like, how difficult did you find coming up with sort of key messages or a tangible action that you thought would be palatable to your particular audience? How did you come up with shaping it too? How did you think about, things like, well, are they going to like a straight up no, don't do it, or do we frame it as a deny and delay? So like, well, maybe not now, but maybe later, or any of those kinds of things. What were people's experiences in terms of thinking through that process of what would be your key messages beyond just no, don't build the stadium, right? Like that's a pretty stark one. And how did you think through what that would look like in terms of recommending to people based on what you thought about your audience? Does anybody have anything they'd like to share about that experience, that exercise? Yeah, Lorena.
Yeah, I agree that I think that is such a big challenge because that message is so important. And I think in some ways, like, our group had a lot of consensus about what those messages or recommendations are, but then to get it to a nice, short, concise kind of idea I think that takes time, and I think it's difficult, like, to figure out where do you go and how much time do you take to do this. That again, I really enjoyed it, but it was like, damn, this is hard to figure out what's the one message, and to do it in 15 minutes, it's like, no, that is a challenge.
It is tricky. And yeah, and of course, you're in a pressurized environment. No one would ever do this in 15. I mean, sometimes you were given an issue at 9 a.m. and told to get something in front of a minister by noon or earlier. And so you would be surprised at the speed at which you are required to think through these things, particularly if you work on the political side. Less so if you work on the civic administration side, but as you get higher up in those degrees, it happens. But definitely if you're political staff, you will get an issue at 9 and be told to have something for somebody to say at 11, or even 10, or even 15 minutes from now. So it does happen, not that frequently though. Emily.
Yeah, thanks. This has been such a wonderful exercise. And one of the things we chatted about, again, is just like the positionality of the person who's drafting the brief and how that's going to be received by the person who's reading it. So not only this kind of language game and trying to, figure out what, as you said, Ashley, like the needs of, in this case, the decision makers or the policy readers and crafters, but the relationship between the two, right? So how are they going to hear me as a, let's say, academic researcher versus maybe a concerned parent with kids in grassroots sport, which is the example I used, the level of credence that those any brief would bring, is there's going to be a spectrum of that. So to keep that in mind when you're crafting any piece of writing for that.
I think that's really insightful. And sometimes you would be surprised at where the power sits in that, what is seen as more powerful. If you get something from a parent advocacy group that lands on a minister's desk that has sort of, say, a cross Canada coalition of parents groups that are involved in a sport, that sometimes has far more weight and urgency to it than something that would come from an academic. And we sometimes think that because we have an institutional association that gives us legitimacy and credibility and all these kinds of things. But sometimes it also can make us hidden, right? Because you're seen as sort of another institutional player rather than somebody who's directly impacted by the decision, whether or not that's true. And so I think that that's a really important insight in terms of not only does your audience matter, but what does your audience think of where the message is coming from? What does that relationship look like? And that goes back to that earlier reflection again around how do you develop those relationships so that you will be heard? So we've given you a lot of the mechanics around writing a brief, but I'd like to touch on that exactly, that those briefs don't really do anything unless you have a good relationship in play. And so it's really important to think about building that soft infrastructure with the players that you need to work with before you're going to land something on their desk, so that you have that kind of trust buildup, so that they know who you are and what your goals are, and that you are, even if you are miles apart on certain topics, you're aligned on this one, that we want kids to be safe when they participate in sport, or that we want to make sure that our investment benefits the community. Or in this case, we talked a little bit, if you spend 200 million on this, there's not 200 million available to something else, right? That 200 million then becomes unavailable to health, or to infrastructure, or to other parts of maybe of sport, right? Of sport that you want to see happen that would be better off spent. So we're at kind of 5 minutes left. I'm going to maybe turn it over to you, Kyle, or to the group to say if there's any last thoughts, heartburn, things that you want to say that you're going to take away from this, anything that anyone wants to say before we kind of say arrivederci and thank you for your time. But I do want to say thank you so much for your active participation, for going along with the exercise. I really like it when people just sort of like give it a go and for being so attentive and engaged. So thank you so much for making my job a lot easier despite all the hiccups, and for being such a great group to work with. So over to you, Kyle.
Yeah, no, thank you. Thank you so much, Ashley. I know I always love listening to you talk about this stuff. You're so passionate about it and you have so many awesome insights. So thank you so much. That virtual applause.